Hey folks, today I want to give you guys a quick summary of what we've done so far on the Revolution as a way to give you guys a study guide so you'll be prepared for your test when you have to remember all the many aspects of the Revolution. We started our first cause, which was the French and Indian War. What you're looking at is the territory that this was fought over. Another significant point is that the Benjamin Franklin, for the first time, got a bunch of delegates together in 1754 in the Albany Plan to try to get the Iroquois on the side of the colonists, which sort of succeeded, but the Albany Plan in general came up with this whole idea of a union, which is where we see that the snake propaganda, the join or die thing. In the end, it gets rejected both by the states and by London, and the Iroquois will be sort of the biggest ally that the British and colonists have in this battle. Otherwise, most of the Native Americans are going to side with the French. It takes a while for this war really to heat up, I guess. There's not a lot going on with it until William Pitt, as we talked about in class, threw a lot of money at the problem. He sent more British troops, and it was General Wolfe, which you're looking at a picture of him dying in the Battle of Quebec, and Jeffrey Amherst, who really were the decisive factors in this war. They were sort of the version of Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, if you know the Civil War at all, which you don't, because you'll study it next year. Anyway, this was painted after the fact, but of the Battle of Quebec, when Wolfe brought his army up a little ravine out behind Quebec to win that battle the following day. Montreal fell shortly after, and this was sort of towards the end of the war. The reason this is the cause of the Revolutionary War is all this land that was fought over actually is off limits to the colonists after the war. The British passed the Proclamation of 1763, which doesn't allow colonists to settle over the line at which you're looking. So the colonists feel like they've been screwed because they fought this war on behalf of the British and now they've won it and they're not entitled to any of the land. Whereas, of course, we know the motivation for this is that the British are now poor from this war, and this is so there's no further battling with Native Americans, which would mean more war, which would mean more debt. That's going to happen anyway with Pontiac's War, Pontiac's Rebellion, whatever you want to call it. It was sort of an inconclusive war. They fight back and forth in the Ohio River Valley over these forts, but it keeps the British troops in the colonies, which becomes permanent, and it's going to lead us into our Quartering Act, which is coming up in a second. As I said, it's sort of an inconclusive back and forth. Eventually, there's a peace treaty signed, and hostilities cease. However, this will be an ongoing thing between colonists and Native Americans for many years to come. So the British policy, the mercantilist policy that they had, is really going to be stifling to the colonies, and this ties closely in with the taxation that we're going to see in a bit, which is basically how England tries to make all their money back, both through the system of mercantilism, where all trade has to go through England before it goes anywhere else, but also you're going to start to see England really start to enforce its policies on the colonies after the French and Indian War. And the first thing is what we talked about in class, which is the Quartering Act and Mutiny Act. Colonists had to start to house and feed British soldiers. The British soldiers were stuck there because of Pontiac's War, which is sort of a after effect of the French and Indian War. And the Mutiny Act is that the colonists start to be subject to the discipline of the British soldiers and commanders, and that makes them very, very angry. And it's going to lead us a couple years down the line, in 1770, to the Boston Massacre, which you'll hear about in class tomorrow. The first tax that the British put on these goods, coming into the colonies, is on sugar and molasses, which was something that had existed previously, but it was an increase on these duties. The response, of course, from the colonists is smuggling. They don't want to pay these taxes, so they're doing their best to get around it, and that's why you see the top note here is that the Molasses Act loses money, which is crazy that it was, for whatever reason, George Grenville thinks that reducing the tax will actually bring more profit. George Grenville was the minister of the colonies appointed by King George III, who was actually sort of new to the post of king in England, and George Grenville was his sort of number two when it came to the colonies, and he was trying to raise money off the colonies to help England pay back the war of the French and Indian War. And if you look at the statistics, the English were way more heavily taxed in England than the colonists ever would, but they're going to resist it with everything they have because they feel it's unfair. The one that they first really take issue with is the Stamp Act, which is a tax on cards, pamphlets, newspapers, diplomas, legal documents, all the stuff you see there, and more. And the reason that the colonists are so angry about this is because it's an internal tax. It's a new tax. Tariffs were known, taxing goods that come into a country. That happens. This is a new leveraged tax on a certain good that really makes the colonists angry. Some newspapers threatened to shut down. Angry colonists, as we talked about, tarred and feathered. They were known to bury tax collectors alive to try to get them to resign. And we talked about how Hutchinson's house was destroyed and all of his letters were stolen and published, and it got pretty dicey. And eventually, down in Virginia, the resistance comes from Patrick Henry, who sort of coins the term "no taxation without representation." So we both have this physical resistance and this political resistance. And finally, we will get the Stamp Act repealed, and this is sort of the death of the Stamp Act cartoon from the newspapers in the colonies, as if they're really mourning. They're pumped to get rid of the stamp tax, and it proves to them that their resistance works. So if the King and George Grenville should try to tax in another way, I'm sure that at this point they think that they could get away with whatever it is, smuggling and harassing and anything to not pay these taxes. So the response from the Crown and from Grenville and Parliament over in England is that they'll pass the Declaratory Act in 1766. So as they're repealing the Stamp Act, they're saying, we are the authority on all cases whatsoever in the colonies, and you will do what we say. In other words, when we tax you again, we're going to make sure that you're going to pay it. And this has been Franklin's point of view on all this. We have an old mother that peevish has grown. She snubs us like children that scarce walk alone. She forgets we're grown up and have a sense of our own. Obviously similar to what Patrick Henry's saying with no taxation without representation. The next round of tax is coming from another minister of the colonies, Charley Townshend, who's acting on someone else's behalf, actually, and he strategically taxes things that he does not think are worth smuggling. And he sets up an enforcement mechanism through which they'll make sure that they gather the revenue from these taxes, which are the Board of Customs committees, and they're wildly corrupt. If you arrested someone for smuggling, you got a third of the fine on that person. The judge got a third, and a third of it went to the government. So it was in the judge's best interest to convict people, and it was in your best interest to get people for smuggling. Now, the colonists have resistance of their own. They're going to continue smuggling, but they also come up with this thing called the non-importation agreement, which is a way for them to force others to not import these goods so that they do not pay the tax, so it will eventually get repealed the way the Stamp Act did. And of course, the Sugar Act got reduced. So in the end, this is going to fail, and it's for the same reasons we talked about before: the violent physical resistance from the Sons of Liberty and others, which we'll talk about in class, and this, which is non-importation, which is the way that the colonists resisted paying this tax was simply by not buying these goods. And the way they enforced this is that colonists who were against the tax would snitch on their neighbors and print their names in the newspaper if they were breaking this code of non-importation and paying the taxes that the colonists didn't want to pay because they wanted to get rid of it. Eventually newspapers in England will start to write about this, and what I wrote here on the slide is it's sort of an economic declaration of independence. It's a way of saying that we don't need your goods and we're not going to pay your taxes. If it means we're not going to buy your goods, fine, and we'll find ways to make sure that everyone around us is doing that until you repeal this. And eventually we're going to see a lot of that activism coming from this group called the Sons of Liberty, which is what we'll cover in class tomorrow. So this is the first half of your Revolutionary War causes. Second half coming up.